Because the issue of slavery is not a one-dimensional issue. It's not just Muslims had slaves and that was the end of it, or transatlantic slavery. It's really a topic that all parties, all nations, all civilizations have had a hand in at some point. But the level of involvement and complicity is oftentimes hidden. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover a broad canvas, not just Muslim slavery, but slavery in general and specific cases in contemporary times. And so I think it's really a timely position, a timely opportunity for us to discuss candidly and openly, and academically, most importantly, the reality of this issue here. I disagree heavily with hiding information, twisting information, or doing the pointing game. What about them? What about them? I don't believe in that at all. If you're going to engage on a topic such as this topic, you must be at least objective on the principles. So we're not going to focus on what about them, the Bible and the Bible verses. Quite frankly, is irrelevant to us. We're going to focus on the historic narrative, the evidence, the textual references, which will all be displayed on screen. Nothing is hidden here. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. This is actually the closest I'm ever going to get when it comes to like the program or even Historian as a project, to touching upon adillah from the Quran and Sunnah and from the ijma' sahaba. It's the closest I'm ever going to get to that, because typically I try to stay away from that. I'm not a da'iyah, it's not a da'wah channel or project, and I will not represent Islam based on my personal opinions. However, because of the nature of this specific topic, I have had to rely upon primary sources, the Quran, the Sunnah, ijma' sahaba, and other qiyas, very weak qiyas. I've had to do that by necessity. But I want to preface by saying that wherever I recite or cite a verse or a hadith, it will always be present on the screen. I've taken stringent measures to only utilize sahih hadith, not da'if, not hasan, sahih, where possible. So I've really applied the strictest standard, because I don't want to mispronounce statements or misrepresent information. So I've taken it upon myself to make sure that wherever Islam is being represented textually, I'm bringing forth evidence that is clear, can be verified, and is not ambiguous. Because oftentimes what I find in these discussions, ambiguity helps the narrative. People utilize ambiguous statements or weak logical inferences to push a point, and they never give the actual evidence. And so this for me is dishonesty, intellectually speaking. And if we're going to embark upon an honest discussion, let us be academically rigorous. So I will be applying very strict standards. And if I fall short, I ask Allah to forgive me. My intentions are always good when it comes to these sorts of things. I have no hidden intentions. I am neither an apologetic for those who seek to abrogate the history of Islam and the slavery that was practiced in the past. I'm not one of those people who say it never existed. Neither am I one of those people who is saying that it exists, it still exists, and we champion this. It's one of our pillars of Iman. Between these two extremes, there is a middle balance, and that's where I stand. So if I fall short of that standard, just realize that it wasn't an intention from me. So not an apologetic, not a confrontational, just an objective historical analysis. The second criteria I'm applying here is that this is entirely academic and historical. This is not a personal opinion-based critique of what others have said. It is not an emotionally based critique of what I feel about slavery. It is an academic presentation, and Allah is my witness. This is something I've actually been holding on to for many years. I've considered it. I've even announced it at times and taken it back. But I've never felt the need and the urge to put it out as much as I'm feeling it today and right now, because of the current condition. And these topics are really kind of disturbing, to be honest, and the way it's being conveyed by the Muslim online community. there has to be some redress and some restraint. And so I'm almost being compelled to do it. I don't feel like doing it, but I feel the need, and also, quite frankly, the obligation to defend Islam, not only from those who are hostile to Islam, but those who think they're helping Islam, but are perhaps unsuspectingly helping the opponents of Islam. So this is completely academic, it's not emotionally based, objective as much as possible, and finally fully referenced with complete disclosure and bibliography. The last thing I want to do is to put out information that will be said it came from AZ or it came from Ustad Ibrahim. I don't want that at all. What I would like to do is to be a conduit to say, I have cited it, but here's a reference. You can go and verify the entire book or the entire chapter. I don't want anything to come back to me as a personal opinion or a statement. So I will be disclosing everything. The books, the pages, the sub-notes, anything relevant will be disclosed. And so these are the parameters within which I hope, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, to present this topic. And keep this in mind, that, again, it is purely for the sake of academic discussion, also to defend Islam, but also to be open and candid. I have no hidden motive. There's no money being made from this. There's nothing that I'm actually, besides love of history and love of Islam, there's nothing. I have no hidden motive. I don't debate anyway, so I have no opponent to debate. It's purely academic, and I'm stressing it because it's important. You will hear things that you may not like. All right, so later on, you may not like it. Keep in mind, I'm not saying it because I feel I need to impress upon you, you have to accept it. I'm just telling you this is how it is. I may not like it, but this is how it is, okay? So keep that in mind, inshallah. Don't see me as an obstacle to the knowledge. Yeah? Right, so I have called this possessed. Okay, so possessed effectively encapsulates. I couldn't think of a more powerful word in the English lexicon to encapsulate the essence of slavery. Possessed, to be owned, to be commodified, to be under somebody else's control, to be possessed. And this is effectively the central theme of the entire presentation. Yeah? The possession of human beings in the process of making them slaves, as practiced by not only Muslims, but antiquity in general. All nations and civilizations participated in this. Until very recently, by the way, World War I. You'd be very surprised to hear that. Until very recently. So the truth about slavery in Islam. Now, I drew much attention online when I posted a quote or a statement in which I said, slavery is not Islamic. Slavery is not Islamic. And that was the subtext of this presentation. And I still hold to that premise. Slavery is not Islamic. And having said that, in the words of Frantz Fanon, I shall now prove it. I have the burden of having to prove that statement. Slavery is not Islamic. One of the things that I often find, there are 2 or 3 topics that really causes doubt, a bit of kind of uncertainty in the hearts and minds of Western Muslims. Maybe not the wider Muslim world, but Western Muslims certainly. It's the community I've had the most experience living with and interacting with. 1 or 2 topics really causes a difficulty when it comes to discussing Islamic history. One of them, of course, is certainly slavery and everything that comes with slavery. Concubines, children from slavery, all of that comes under that. And we have a difficult time discussing this in amongst ourselves, but also individually taking on the ideas that come with history. Unfortunately, we have sometimes very, very unproductive approaches to this, as I said before. One could be just ignore the entire chapter. There's no benefit in talking about this. It's not relevant to you anymore. Ignore it. It's in the past. So we don't have to discuss these issues. It is harmful. It is potentially a fitna. So ignore everything. That excuse was useful before the internet. Before the internet and social media, that approach was a viable approach. And I would say I would have favored that approach in that day and age. Do not embark upon this sort of topic because, first of all, it's not relevant to the majority of people on earth today. And secondly, it does cause a problem for those who cannot comprehend and grasp it. But we live in the age of the internet, unfortunately, and fortunately. There are forums, channels, blogs, pages, websites, documentaries, films, debates, lectures, you name it is available, books discussing these issues. And we find it becoming more and more predominant when we come to the interreligious and intercultural dialogues or debates. This continues to be raised. And so we no longer have the opportunity to say, just forget about it. This is beyond the point of forgetting about it. We have now to address it head on. We have to interpret and explain this, our history, because it's a global history, but our history, our share of it, before others do it for us. Before others do it for us. And I've been saying this for years. I've been saying it for years. The da'wah goes through cycles. We went through the scientific cycle. Everything was about science, scientific theories, evolution. Nobody cares about that anymore. We've gone beyond that. We went before that with the biblical and Quranic debates and comparatives. We've outgrown that now. Then we went to the social dynamics of men and women, gender, equality and Islam, and we're still in that cycle. But the ultimate destination is the historical cycle. Going back to history, pulling out information and presenting it today. This is what you Muslims did in the past. Does Islam condone that? We are very much in that cycle right now. Okay, so we really need to go beyond the turn a blind eye to it. We have to look into it now, because our children may come to us one day and say, is it true that Islam condones slavery? You know, right? Organizations, NGOs, many of them go by the anti-slavery acts and rights. It comes under human rights. Our children are also being taught about these things as part of their curriculum. So to live in a world that focuses on this topic so often and so openly, when a Muslim child or an adolescent comes across a hadith, or maybe especially historical accounts dealing with slavery, or worse yet, popular Muslim figures holding the sign saying we are pro-slavery, we are, it's part of our deen, it can cause a serious crisis of faith for these people. It can cause a serious crisis of faith for the people. And I'll show examples that I've gathered online. Didn't take much research, to be honest. One video, I found thousands of them, but I picked just a few representative comments to encapsulate this sort of crisis within the Muslim community itself. So this was a comment left beneath one of these apologetic videos. And the person says, thank you very much for dissecting this part and uploading it. I was depressed about the consent issue for 4 days. This is the question of, do slaves have consent? Okay. I was depressed about this for 4 days. 4 days, depression. Even had waswas, whisperings from shaitan to leave Islam. But Allah guided me to this video. Jazakallahu khairan. Alhamdulillah. We shouldn't underestimate the severity of these things, which is why I consider it irresponsible, if you have a large following, to open this door and then not to provide any kind of viable solution to the problem that it causes. Because when you open the door to this discussion, people have doubts. If the only solution you present to them is that you don't have enough iman, it's part of our deen, you have to believe in it, you push them away from Islam. You push them away from Islam. All right, that's the wrong way to approach it. Either keep the door locked, or if you open the door, make sure you're able to deal with what comes with that. Okay, so people are having waswas, whispers. They're not sure about Islam anymore. They're depressed. I'm pretty sure this is either a sister, a woman, or a child. Yeah, because usually the men, and we'll talk about this, when we talk about slavery, men, when it comes to the issue of who has the most to lose, we have the least to lose and the most to gain. So typically these comments come from not men, from sisters, from children, from young people. And I believe these are important comments. We need to pay attention to this. Another comment says, I know how you feel, brother. So responding to another person, I've been in this position for some time, starting to come to terms with it. Okay. Now, it doesn't say, I found a satisfactory response. I feel convinced intellectually and also various ways emotionally. I feel convinced. I just come to terms with it. It's a defeatist mentality. I cannot make sense of it. I cannot accept it, but I've just come to accept it. Not everybody responds that way. Some people, if they can't reconcile with what they think is right and what they're seeing as being presented as right, will abandon. They're not going to say, I'm going to just come to terms with it. They'll abandon. Yeah, so it does push people to the edge. I was also depressed about the consent till this morning. I also had waswas of shaitan and to leave Islam. Alhamdulillah, this matter is totally clear. Okay, then we have another one. If the women were taken as slaves or preventing them from entering prostitution, why can't they be kept as household slaves only? In other words, why do they have to be sexual partners? This is in response to the proposal that concubines were effectively being saved from a life of prostitution. Had they not been taken as concubines, they would be left to prostitution in society. And I've addressed that in the group. I'll reiterate it in this presentation. So this person is saying, thinking more critically, okay, you want to save them from prostitution? Fine, take them as housemaids. Why do you have to use them for physical needs? I am a Muslim, and I've been having so many doubts lately. Hopefully, I will get a satisfying answer. This is a person who's thinking, is not satisfied with the answer. Saying, I'm still a Muslim, but I'm still unable to reconcile. One day, hopefully, I'll get an answer. Okay? These are serious topics. These are real human beings who have real problems. Okay? And they're addressing it. Unfortunately, it's not always clear to them whether the answers they're receiving are actually genuine, because many of those who give the answers are apologists. So they're seeking just to make people feel happy with information. But it's never satisfactory, because you're not giving me everything. I can see you're holding back. So I'm not fully convinced that what you're telling me is correct. It makes me feel nice, but I know it's not everything. It's similar to, for example, the discussion of ta'addud, polygyny. Right? I'm sure you've seen as well, people explaining it as, this is a last resort. If all the men go to war and men die and there's no other option, then we can apply this rule. And even then, if the wife is only sick and then she can't have babies, you can apply this rule. And even then, the ayah says that you have to look after the orphans, and if you can't look after the orphans, so it only applies to orphans, not anyone else. And you can see people saying, okay, that sounds good. But they know, if that were the case, we wouldn't see it in the world. Right? There are many people who don't have orphans to look after, who have never gone to war. There's no shortage of, and they're still practicing it. So it sounds nice, but I know in reality it doesn't apply to reality. Okay, it's a band-aid again. It does not apply to reality. So the way to address this, as we know, the best disinfectant is sunlight. The best disinfectant is sunlight. You put everything under the sun, the light will disinfect the problem. And the same applies to this issue of slavery. Telling people that this was akin to having a brother in your house. We're going to be brothers. Slave, just like my brother. Slave woman, just like my sister. And she has full consent. And she will not, and she gets all the rights of a wife. Disingenuous. And it's not satisfactory. People know. That's not what slavery is about. If that was slavery, we wouldn't have the problem we're having today in these discussions. That sounds nice, but was it applicable? The historical record says no. And the final critical comment says, so the best thing for a female captive is to marry her? In other words, you're telling us that the best option, the best hope for this woman is that she'll be married to her captor, her slave owner. Can't she just be freed? And I said this in the comments when we had the discussion. Why must you stop at just marrying the woman? What if she doesn't want to marry you? What if she feels the trauma of having lost her husband or her family, and she doesn't want to marry somebody who was part of the army that raided her village, for example? Giving you an example. Do you think she wants to marry the person who was part of that? She may not want to marry you. If you're looking for the optimal solution, you want to be virtuous, just let her go. Free her. The Prophet did it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on many occasions. So this person is saying the same thing. You are stopping us at the point of marriage and telling us this is the best option available. But there is something better than that, which is فَقُّ رَقَبَةً. Free that person with no conditions. And I agree with that sentiment. Okay? We can focus a lot about slaves get the same rights as the women, the wife in the house. She'll be the same as another wife. She'll be recognized. What if she doesn't want that? What if she doesn't want that? And we have examples of that. Barira, didn't want that, radiallahu anha, from Mughith, right? It's very reasonable to say most of the women in captivity may not want to marry their captors, even if he's a nice person. So if you take that out of the equation, is there anything else you can offer her? Complete freedom. Why don't we focus on that? Okay, so we're going to get into all of this, inshallah. So these are representative comments that I found online, as I said, very easily. There were literally thousands of them. Okay, but I felt this really captures the essence of this discussion here. And I can empathize and sympathize with all of these different perspectives. Because at certain points in my own life and development as a Muslim, I went through these, thinking about it. How is it possible? I'll give you one of the earliest examples that I've actually experienced as a child. As I watched the life of Jesus Christ as a child. As a child in France, they have it every Easter. So part of the culture there at that time, I used to watch it and to have pancakes at the time. And I remember, I'll never forget the moment I saw this in the film, and it was inaccurate. It was a fabrication, but it had an impact on me. Is when Jesus meets slaves. He meets slaves. I was no more than 8 years old. He meets slaves. And they ask him about the kingdom to come and then he tells them that they are just like him. They're free, and that the soul cannot be sold, and that they are free, and that his religion was going to free them. I cried. I cried at 8 years old. Yeah, it touched me. I grew up, I understood history, and I realized that was a complete falsification of history. Complete falsification. Nothing like it at all. Okay? So it has an impact on people. It's not a trivial matter. You don't have enough iman. How can this shake your iman? You need to check your iman again. Check your aqidah. You're not in the right place. All right, sister, you need to fix yourself. Your iman should be higher than this. Oh, brother, what are you talking about? Are you a modernist? Allah has put His hukm in the Quran, and you're trying to challenge that? Are you more merciful than Allah? These are things we hear all the time. But the problem is, the premise is that this is, in its first place, a pillar or a component of iman. And that's where the problem begins. Who made it a component of iman to begin with? Or a pillar of iman to begin with? Who made that a pillar? That's the question. So when I begin by saying it's not Islamic, that's where I'm talking from, that level. It is not a component of iman to own or to validate or to, to uphold the institution of slavery. It is not a marker of faith. Okay? We need to stop blackmailing people, pressurizing people to accept it. Otherwise, you are now somebody who has denied the hukm of Allah. Allah is wiser than you are, more merciful than you, denying what He has legislated. Who told you He legislated it that way in the first place? So we're going to get to that, inshallah. As much as I could fathom from the different angles I've gathered information, it's not exhaustive. It could be a lot longer, a lot deeper. But consider it an introduction to this topic. An introduction based on historical sources and academic approach to this topic. It could be a lot deeper. It could be a lot deeper. On each one of these topics, we can spend another 5 hours on each one of them, a module. But I'm just condensing it, and hopefully that will give you enough material to pursue your own independent research. It's important to have that independent research, to go out and to research for yourself and verify. Bismillah. So I'm going to begin with definitions. As always, we begin with definitions in English, but also from the Muslim perspective. The issue of presentism. Presentism is the reason why we have these debates in the first place, quite frankly. It's the reason why we have these debates in the age of Aisha, slavery in Islam. It's the reason why we have this. Had we lived 150 years ago, it would not be a talking point. In fact, it has never been a talking point. It has never been a talking point. Until relatively recently, 40, 50 years ago. Prior to that, it has never been a talking point. Why? Because it was something that was widely accepted. It was a conventionality of the world. And it wasn't considered strange. It wasn't considered deviant. It was part of every civilization's experience. So this is a present malady that haunts us today. It's the first time we're having these discussions. So presentism has to be addressed, because the way we look at the past will also impact how we interpret the past. We cannot look at the past with the eyes of the present. We cannot do that. So we have to address this before we move on to anything else. Presentism is a key cause for these discussions and debates to begin with, quite frankly. Then pre-Islamic slavery. So let's look at slavery before Islam, because slavery predates Islam. Islam did not come to institute slavery or to invent slavery or to promote. It was already there, and in fact towards the tail end, when we look at the historical perspective, millennia, towards the tail end of it, Islam comes along and has to reform and adapt to what was already prevalent in society, but it did not originate slavery. We have to really get that clear. It did not come to institute slavery or to regulate it in the sense that we're going to apply it in Arabia. It's never been done before. That wasn't the case. It was already there. It was already there. Islam, or the dawn of Islam and slavery. So now that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the 7th century proclaims the message of Islam, and Islam as a theology and a system and a way of life is being promoted and practiced in Arabia, how does it interact with slavery? How does it work? Because people say, for example, if Islam is the truth, why does it not abrogate slavery altogether? It's a false equivalence. There's no connection logically there. What does Islam being the truth have to do with abrogating slavery? If that were the measure for truth, throw away all of the classical texts when it comes to logic, reason, ethics, philosophy, moral virtues. Throw them all away. Because none of them apparently had been able to achieve that feat of completely abrogating slavery. So if it wasn't applicable to those people, why only for the Muslims? Why only for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Why is that the only measure for his truth? Why is that the only measure for his truth? We have to address that as well. Then the high standard. So Islam comes along. Slavery is a reality. It's a fact of everyday living. People do it from China all the way to Byzantium, in Africa all the way up to the European regions. It is just done. It's a way of living. People actually establish economies based on it. Social strata. It's just a part of existence, quite frankly. But how does Islam deal with it? Okay, there are new parameters. There are new laws and codes of conduct introduced. Wonderful. And in fact, I will say, no religious faith in the history of mankind has done more for slavery in reducing the impacts than Islam has. And that's a statement I'm willing to stand by. No religious faith or tradition has done more towards liberating people from slavery than Islam has. In fact, we have, and this can be interpreted in two ways, literally, but also metaphorically. Before the Battle of Qadisiyah, the Muslims were sent to speak to the Sassanid general Rustam, and a number of Sahaba went to speak to him, one by one to speak to him. One of the Sahaba who spoke to him, he asked him, Rustam said to him, why are you coming out of the desert, disheveled, looking like something we don't even want to mention, coming to us, a high civilization. What do you want with us? And he says to him, to Rustam, we have come to liberate people in generality from the worship of men to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To take them from the constriction of this life to the vast expanse of the hereafter in eternity. Liberation of men. Now some people take that and say this is the statement that abrogation, that would be dishonest. That's not what he meant. But in general terms, Islam has come to liberate people in all forms. Wherever there is oppression and constriction, Islam has come to liberate them economically, physically, spiritually, sexually, morally, many ways. And slavery is one of the subcomponents of that. So there is a higher standard. Islam has lifted the bar, raised the bar. Unfortunately, that bar was raised for us and we regressed. The following generations regressed, and I'm going to demonstrate how that happened. But the point is, the bar was raised. And very short after the life of the Prophet ﷺ, we have significant reformations. Had the Muslims taken that as a cue to continue, slavery would have been completely abolished in the 7th, 8th century, maximum 9th century. but we didn't do that. Okay? So there is a high standard here. The highest standard is one that would lead ultimately towards abrogation of slavery altogether, abolition. That's the highest standard. And the premise for that highest is in the Quran. It's clear. It's clear. It's in the Quran. The highest standard is in the Quran, but it's also in the hadith, the sunnah of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The highest standard is there, as we will see, as we look at, for example, chapter 6, the reforms of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu. Some people don't have an idea as to just the extent to which he reformed many administrative tasks, social reforms, but also in regards to slavery. Tremendous reformations. He lifted the bar so high. Radiallahu anhu. Al-Faruq, the man who understood right and wrong, who had more ghayra than Umar, radiallahu anhu, who had more jealousy, protective jealousy than Sayyidina Umar. But he lifted the bar so high. Yeah, so high. Had we kept it where he left it, or we pushed it a bit higher, as I said before, slavery would have been completely abolished in the Muslim world, at least in the 8th century. In the 8th century. So I want to spend a lot of time on that. His reformations. Mind-blowing, in fact. Mind-blowing. You wonder, how is it that I've never heard about this before? It's not being applied then until very recently. We didn't go by the high standard, we kept by the low standard. The Quran talks about this, by the way. Minkum man yuridu dunya. Ibn Mas'ud said, I never imagined that anyone amongst the Sahaba could go to war for the sake of booty, ghanima, until Allah revealed this ayah, Al Imran, Minkum man yuridu dunya. If you look at the tafasir on that. Okay? So there is a real human element here. Human beings want possessions. And we are hard. It is very difficult for us to relinquish that. Very difficult to relinquish that. And so the issue of owning concubines, certainly there's going to be a resistance, because there is a very clear incentive and motive for people to have them to this very day. Finally, chapter 7, stagnation, regression. So here we're going to look at the actual examples from recent history, the 20th century, and antiquity, following Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's death until recent history, various examples of slavery being practiced amongst the Muslims, and against the precepts and principles of Islam and Islamic teachings. I mean to demonstrate by this that it's not Islamic. It wasn't Islamic. By definition and by implementation, it wasn't Islamic. But there was a need and a desire to maintain the system because there were financial incentives. Socially speaking, you have free labor, and also sensual incentive. I don't think I have to explain too much. The standard was raised, the incentive was given to us in the Quran and Sunnah, but men have their own ways, they have their own desires, they have their own objectives. And so we have been effectively carrying this burden for longer than we've had to carry it, because we had alternative desires. So I'm going to give you examples, real examples. Not abstract, real examples. Because oftentimes the abstract theories divert us. Yes, but a slave master should be kind, and if he slaps his slave, he has to... That's theory, it's nice to hear. But do you really think somebody who spends $10,000 on an asset, that's what it was, is going to liberate that just because of a slap? Do you really believe they're going to apply that to their own lives and merchandise? No. That's a theory, and it's nice in the world of theories, but in reality, it is not the case. You have countries such as, for example, Mauritania, that still have slaves. Right? And Mauritania is a religious nation. Yet, you would assume that if people were really religious to that extent, really pious, they would have liberated all their slaves by now. Why do they still exist? And generational slaves, born into it, generation after generation. Over that long space of time, nobody slapped a slave, nobody hurt a slave. They were all angels. There was no reason to free a slave. Right? So clearly there are incentives, but there's a lot of resistance to let go of this practice. Yeah? We have to be realistic and honest and stop telling people lies effectively. Telling them things that sound nice, but in practicality doesn't make any sense. How do you amass a massive army of slaves, as Zunuj, for example, or the Saqaliba, or the Janissaries, These are massive industrial level operations of slavery. How do you amass that many slaves and still tell me that if you give one of them a slap, you liberate them? How is it possible? Right? Because we're going away from what was intended to what actually makes money and gives us immediate returns. So we're going to have to look at that regression curve and be very honest and not lie to ourselves and not pretend that the fatwa written by the shuyukh who had good intentions was being applied by the slave-owning class and the slave traders and slave raiders. They were not concerned about what Imam al-Shafi'i wrote, and supposedly wrote, because he didn't write that, by the way. That was a gross misquote. But even if he did write that, these are not people who are going to necessarily be concerned about what he wrote. Because the Quran is a higher ideal, a higher authority, and people turn away from it all the time. They turn away from it all the time when it's convenient. So presenting fatwa and statements about the idyllic situation is not a cure to the problem. When we have actual examples from historical narrative that tells us contrary to what we're reading here. So we have to be honest intellectually and pragmatic. Yeah. There's no apology here. Just be honest and direct. We then move on to the issue of concubines. And we're going to spend a long time here. There's a social phenomena when it comes to this issue. Not only in the West, as I've given you a snippet of it, just a snippet of it, of how this concept can actually be taken and effectively mutate into something completely different. In the West, and I'll give you examples of that, it's a certain mentality, where certain Muslims see non-Muslim Christians as basically fair game. They're fair game. And they will justify that through the idea of, we are here for jihad, milk yamin. Also in the East, where we have impoverished, a working class is impoverished. Philippines, certain parts of East Africa, certain parts of the subcontinent, who come as maids. I don't have to speak. I don't have to, if you've spent time, or you have relatives, you will know. If you are in touch with what's happening in the world, you'll know. It's a major issue. Many fatwa have been issued to women, wives, whose husbands have fallen for the maid. Right? And there are many women who don't want to have maids because of that problem. So it's a real issue. And again, we can't pretend that it doesn't exist. Let's turn a blind eye. I've seen one very, very prominent sheikh, very prominent, Qari in fact, and he went to the Philippines. He gave a lecture in the Philippines. I won't share it here. I don't want to put names just for the sake of names. But they asked him, Ya Sheikh, why are we hearing that our people who travel to your land to work as maids are being effectively dishonored, let's put it that way, and abused and violated? And his answer was simple. These women who come to our land are actually causing fitna in our land. They cause marriages to break up. They are guilty of committing sihr, which is magic. They work magic in the house. They bring diseases with them, right? And they are effectively seducing the men from their women. That was the answer he gave in their country. I don't know how he made it out of the building, to be honest with you. Right? He blamed them. Your women are not right, and they come to us and it causes problems. It's a real problem, but it's a silent problem. We don't talk about it. Yeah? If you lift this idea of milk yamin from people's minds, they are left with very little to justify their own shahawat. It's all about shahwa, desire. They hide it behind the idea of milk yamin. Yeah? They hide it behind that curtain. If you lifted that, they'll be left with no option but to just admit, we want illicit relationships. We want an easy time. We just want to have access with no commitment, right? But they use the umbrella of slavery, which is why I think it's pernicious and irresponsible for people to go online with vast audiences and to insist it's a part of Islam, and that Allah, through His wisdom, has made it compulsory, and that if it's not compulsory, at least you have to accept it and champion it and not speak against it, because you are giving certain people the rope they needed in the first place to do what they wanted to do. And if you're a good-natured person, if you live in a healthy environment, you've never heard of, you may think, what is this? I've never heard this before. I say to you, Alhamdulillah, thank Allah. Thank Allah. You live in a society where you don't have to hear about these sorts of things or even conceive of them. But there are many people who hear of this. I'm an example of this. I grew up in London. And London is one of the most cosmopolitan places on earth. As I began to practice Islam at 15 onwards, I met all types of Muslims. But in the golden age of jihad Islam in the West, we even had like Islamic jihad in my neighborhood, right? We had there was an office, Islamic jihad. And so these brothers would come and teach openly. There was no censoring of that. There was no political correctness. And they would tell you, yeah, 𝗾𝗡𝗡𝗡, the Christian women, and take their possessions. It all belongs to you in this country. Break the laws because the laws are not anyway Allah's laws. Nobody can tell me this. I've witnessed it. I've met people. They've told me. I've experienced it. So I know it's real. It's not a theory. It's not something that people say and they won't actually act upon it. I know it's real. Okay? People take, for example, the welfare state as a form of jizya. In the UK, I don't know about other countries. I can only speak for UK. There was a time when certain groups in the UK told their followers to take a council property or welfare is a form of jizya upon the kuffar. It's a duty for you to take that and make your women take that. It's a jizya. Well, it doesn't end there. If you tell somebody it's jizya, what else comes with jizya? With conquering the land, 𝗾𝗡𝗡𝗡. And then there was a time in London, again, I can only speak for London, where certain groups of Muslim men, misguided group, I don't want to make, most of us are good, decent human beings. There were certain groups who literally went out and had extramarital affairs with British women under the pretext, these are our 𝗾𝗡𝗡𝗡. I'm talking from the reality of it. Not just I heard it, the reality of it. And so they will justify that to themselves because these are 𝗾𝗡𝗡𝗡𝗡. So it's really serious. It's not just something that we can brush under the carpet. They're the same as wives. That's problematic in the first place. If you want us to believe that these concubines are the same as a wife and they come to live in the house and they have the same rights, where does that put the wife in her position? Where does she go from there? Think about her position. That she's a wife, she has a family with a man, and he's allowed to take extra wives or maybe slaves, and suddenly the slaves have the same right as she has. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah? The reason why that is given as an explanation is to appease a certain crowd. Don't worry about the concubines, they have the same rights as wives. What about the wife? Have you thought about her position in that setup? The reality is she will never be the same as a wife until he marries her as a wife. Yeah? So we don't have to lie to people to make things seem more pleasing to them. It's not equatable. A concubine and a wife are not. In Islam, there's no book that will tell you they're the same, they have the same right because the man has a slave. It's dishonesty. And we have to stop being dishonest and be direct to the point. So the concubine chapter will be very, very, very intense and detailed. And I'm going to give you actually a very hard-hitting, quite frankly, case study. 3 of them. But the last case study is very hard-hitting because it is actually the reason why many of the comments you've seen previously were written. Yeah? And personally, I believe that it is unacceptable to put out certain messages to mislead people en masse, hoping somehow to get the problem somehow hidden away. Because somebody who knows history, who can research, will easily debunk that. And when they do so, from a hostile perspective, I'm not hostile, but if I were hostile, that will cause greater doubts for those who had doubt to begin with. Because now they're doubting not only the issue, but the source as well is being doubted. If we trusted you on that issue and you misled us, what else are you misleading us about? So now you cause a double problem for the people. Not only the issue that was discussed is in doubt, but the source of the data now is in doubt as well. So now you have a double issue. What is better is to be candid, open, responsible, and forthcoming. Things as they were. There's an ideal and there's a reality. And this is where the two of them either converge or go their separate ways. Yeah? But we're not going to lie to you. Yeah? I value the intellect of everyone who seeks to find the truth. I don't believe you tell people you don't have enough intellect to understand. You don't have enough iman to understand. I'm going to give you the baby version of this story because you don't know whether or not you can handle it. Who are you to tell that person they don't know, they don't have the ability to handle it? This arrogance of we will decide who has the right to know. And by and large, that's the majority of Muslims. They're all juhal anyway, they're all jahil. So most Muslims are jahil. These statements infuriate me because why have we belittled the ummah? Why have we accepted to belittle the ummah on such important issues? If you have understood the concept, why can't she understand the concept? Why can't he has a PhD in, I don't know, physics. You've understood it, right? Why can't he understand it? What made you believe that he won't be able to handle it? Okay, so we need to liberate people from this intellectual kind of handcuff and straitjacket. Because eventually, if you come across, and you will come across these issues, I guarantee you, give it another 5 years, everything being discussed here will be common knowledge, but not for the right reasons. When you come across the issue, unfortunately, from a hostile perspective, the harm is greater. The harm is far greater. Okay? There are many ex-Muslims who have begun to delve into history. So their forte is no longer biblical comparison, it is historical analysis. And they dig into the archives, dig into the books. Now, unfortunately for them, they have no possession of Arabic. They don't understand Islamic culture and heritage. And so they're just blind, looking for anything that will stick. But there are some of them who understand the tradition very well and who've been working for a long time. They understand the tradition very well. Some are ex-Muslims. Some are not Muslim, but they spent a long time. And these are the most dangerous people. They are the most dangerous people. Slowly, they don't have a wide following online, but eventually they'll get there. I promise you, they will get there eventually. There are a few channels I've been following for years now. One of them is a doctor, and the only thing, he's a non-Muslim, he's a Christian European man. His entire career, he's a PhD holder. His entire career, I think he has like 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. On average, 1,000 views. I watch that channel because I'm concerned. You know, the day this guy reaches 1 million subscribers and has a wider impact, the level of academic analysis and stress that he puts in his work is far above many of these da'wah channels. They wouldn't be able to stand in his shadow, to be honest. And his entire career is looking at Quranic manuscripts. Quranic manuscripts. He's a world expert at this. He speaks Arabic properly. And he's been spending all of his life, if you look at his libraries, all masahif, different types, and he can explain it. This is where we're heading. This is where we're heading. And so rather than keep people asleep, let's get them prepared because things are coming. The internet has democratized everything. Everything is opened. There are other channels that again are very small, but again focus entirely upon attack Islam from a historical basis. There are two I can think of top of my head right now. That's all they focus on, historical, and they all have PhDs. All have PhDs. So it is better for us that AZ guide you through this with a good intention, rather than 2 or 3 years from now you come across a certain doctor, PhD holder, who's written 10 books on the topic, who can recite the ayah better than you can recite it, and knows the history of that ayah before you could even think about it, comes to you and tells you, by the way, all of this invented, we have a manuscript from X, Y, and Z, it wasn't correct, and this one was complete. When it comes to having a crisis, that's when it really will hit. And the same with slavery. You know, people who spend their entire career studying these things, under the Ottomans, under the Abbasids, under the Songhai Empire, and they study it, and they have the fatwa permitting it, endorsing it, and they have this issue and that issue. Right? When these people come out from the shadows or from the libraries, from the archives, and step in front of the camera with a large enough audience, we will then have to deal with that, having not done the groundwork to get there. And so, for me, this is a form of preparation for what's to come. It's a form of preparation. So, concubines is a serious issue we have to talk about, really touches upon many points. And then modernization. Slavery in the modern world. Okay? Because to most people, when you say slavery, the modern mind thinks ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Islamic Khilafah. No. Slavery proper only ended after World War I, 1929, with the Geneva Convention, the first Geneva Convention. That was the official, actual application of that, 29. Up until 1949, there were still revisions of that until they had the second edition. Okay, so slavery as a construct only ended recently in the 20th century. Yeah. We are going through an experiment right now, a blip in time. What we think is normal what we think is abnormal has been normal since the time man was created. Yeah. The issue of slavery and owning people, this is for the vast part of humanity and human history, it's been normal. Recently, only recently has it been abnormal. And so we need to see how we got to where we are today. How we got to where we are today. But also the last remnants of this in the popular nations who scream about human rights and slavery, anti-slavery, their part in this. Because up until recently, they were part of taking concubines on an industrial scale during the wars, slaves for labor, all of that was being practiced in Europe, in Asia, and in America, right? On an industrial scale. So part of the hypocrisy of people telling us we have to explain slavery has to be exposed. Tell us first about World War I and the fallout of World War I, because we know slavery was still being practiced by your governments. So explain that first before you seek for us to explain 1400 years of history. Start in 1929 first. So I'm going to demonstrate that, give you the articles, give you the actual information and the examples, because this was something done, as I said, I can't stress enough, on an industrial level in Japan, in Germany, in Poland. Was being done on an industrial level. And you had concubines, you had slaves, literally. It took for one united front and a new agenda and a new convention to change that. The Geneva Convention, which the Muslim states also signed. So for those who say Islam has never outlawed it, you don't know history. Go back to the books and read history. And there are scholars who will tell you that, yes, we have signed it. One example will be shown here in this presentation, saying it's been outlawed now, we don't do it anymore. All the Muslim nations have said that, maybe except one or two here or there. Okay? So we need to understand that. And finally, a bit of a conclusion, and I'll go through a quite sizable bibliography and a few films to watch if you want to get a bit more insight, inshallah.
Welcome to ＨistoryUn, the world's leading online learning platform specializing in Islamic history. Discover the HistoryUn mobile app and participate in regular live and interactive seminars and tune in directly from your handset from anywhere in the world. Enjoy instant access to a growing catalog of on-demand streaming content exclusive to the platform, accessible from a variety of devices including desktops, tablets, and cell phones. Connect instantly with our global community of history enthusiasts via our private community forum. To find out more about our online history programs and resources, visit our website today at www.historyun.com.